they can change their proxy vote to their vote in person later on, as long as they get here by this evening. A couple other points I want to bring out, and one is that there was just an honest disagreement between the chairman and the ranking member as to whether a nominee for Secretary of State, and I would also add for UN ambassador, should be required to make available to our committee 3-year tax returns. They all agreed to make them available. The question is whether we should ask them to see those tax returns. And I accept that there's a different view between the chairman and the ranking member on this issue. And the precedent of our committee in the past is not to physically request those tax returns. And Mr. Chairman, I respect that and agree that that should be done in regular order. And I just will ask at a time when it's appropriate that we look at our rules as to whether we should be requiring, moving forward, beyond Mr. Tillerson, beyond Governor Haley, in the future, if there be a vacancy in Secretary of State or the United Nations ambassador, whether there should be an ability for us to ask for those tax returns moving forward. And I would ask that that opportunity be given to us to take it up as a committee as to whether that is the appropriate way or not. And then I must tell you that members of this committee have asked questions for the record of Mr. Tillerson, and I've looked at some of those responses, and they're not responsive to the questions that were asked. Now, in some cases, it's challenging when you have a change in administration and there's not a clarity as to what the president is looking for on foreign policy to get a nominee to give us a clear answer to those questions. In other cases, the information requested was pretty straightforward. So we are not asking for any delay in today's vote, but I would ask help, and there's no need to respond right now, that we will have a chance before this nominee's vote is on the floor of the United States Senate to try to get further clarification of those answers. And I'm going to work with the chairman, because these requests, I think, are reasonable. I think chairman will agree with us. We're going to try to work that out so that we can get those answers before the vote on the floor. And in that case, I think we could shorten the time period on the floor for the consideration. Otherwise, it may take a little bit longer because we may want to go into some of those issues on the floor of the Senate. So having said all that, let me proceed with the merits of Mr. Tillerson and the nomination of Mr. Tillerson. Mr. Tillerson is certainly sincere and wanting to serve his country, and that I very much admire. He's certainly a very talented individual who has negotiating skills that are important for a person who would become a Secretary of State, and I acknowledge that. He also indicated during the hearing a couple points I thought was useful, that the United States should be at the table during the climate debates, that it would be important to comply with our current laws as it relates to Magnitsky. But what gives me the greatest concern, the reason that I cannot support him, his nomination for Secretary of State, what gives me the greatest pause is that I don't believe his business background and his responses to the questions that we asked him directly about his support for sanctions, or how he would evaluate sanctions moving forward, or how he would deal with contingencies on development assistance as it relates to human rights and good governance. And so many times he qualified that he sounded like a business person rather than a person who wanted to be Secretary of State. And I did not see that commitment to be the advocate globally for human rights and good governance that I would like to see in the Secretary of State. So that was, I think, the greatest concern I have. And when I make it specific to Russia, the questions that were asked about how he would continue sanctions against Russia and support bipartisan legislation that would strengthen those sanctions, I didn't get a comfort level that it would be based upon Russia's conduct against the United States, their attacks against us, where we should, and the fact that they are still violating Ukraine's sovereignty. It seemed like he was wanting to consider other issues that may compromise U.S. global leadership in standing up to Russia. That concerned me. And when you put on top of that the clarity issues, and I think this was a very important point, and I contrast that to Governor Haley's response on questions such as Russia's participation in atrocities in Syria. When we asked would that be elevated to war crimes, Mr. Tillerson was not clear at all. Governor Haley was very clear about that. Or when I asked Mr. Tillerson about the conduct of the president of the Philippines in extrajudicial killings, which was pretty clear, and he wouldn't characterize that as gross violations of human rights. That caused me serious concern. So let me just amplify that a little bit further in another question that was asked. Mr. Tillerson responded to a question in regards to opening up business relationships with Cuba, that would be helping to finance a repressive regime. And he was pretty clear about his, and we certainly would want him to do that as Secretary of State. For all those reasons, I will be voting against Mr. Tillerson's confirmation.
I wonder if we could do this. We've got a number of members here that have other things to do. I'm willing to stay and keep the record open for people to speak, and I'm going to stay here so that people who are coming in late can vote in person and not by proxy. Okay, I'm more than glad to do that, at least to 5:15, to make sure that people are just not voting by proxy. I wonder if there'd be any objection to us voting and letting those who don't want to stay and make comments leave. Others will be coming in. We're going to keep the vote open. But those who wish to make comments could then stay. Others who do not wish to make comments could go ahead and leave. Is there any objection to that?
Let me just ask I was not aware. I don't know if some of my members would like to make their comments before the vote is open, if members have that right to do that. I think Senator Menendez would. Is there any other member who wants to be heard before we start the vote? That I would ask Senator Menendez to be. Okay,
let me just say one other thing.
Senator Markey.
Okay. You sure we can't have a rolling vote where those who don't wish to necessarily hear the comments could go ahead and vote and leave? Is there any real objection to that?
I regret that they don't want to hear the comments, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
But I'd like to have my reasons before I vote, not in the aftermath of a vote.
Okay. I apologize to the other members who are here and ready to vote. Let me just, if I could, I mean, we're accommodating folks who are traveling, and we're glad to do so. If we could keep our comments brief, and then if you want to expand further after people have voted, that would be great. I would like to say that what we're doing as it relates to tax returns is exactly what we're doing, what we've done for 10 years on this committee. 10 years. So we treated Secretary Kerry, Secretary Clinton exactly in the same fashion. So I know that, we did the nuclear option, so now all of a sudden it just takes 51 votes. That was a big mistake, I think, but that's the way things are now. And so now we're looking at changing the rules to tax returns at some point. I hope that doesn't happen because, again, most of those are used for gotcha questions. They have nothing to do with service. But, I hope we can talk about that some. But please know, these two nominees, or this nominee and the one we'll deal with tomorrow, we've dealt with exactly the same way we've dealt on this committee for 10 years. And just because we were so overly helpful to the Obama administration in getting nominees out doesn't mean I want to be unhelpful or treat our nominees, these nominees who are coming in a different fashion. So I'd just like to get that straight. And what Mr. Tillerson said was he'd be glad to provide tax information regarding the 3 years. But the kind of questions that have been asked, I will accommodate some additional questions being asked, but asking about cutting horses on his ranch is a ridiculous question. So I don't know what's happened all of a sudden in this committee where we're asking silly, ridiculous elementary questions that have nothing to do with somebody serving as Secretary of State. But I'm willing to accommodate some of that. With that, Senator Menendez.
Mr. Chairman, I must interrupt just for one moment. I must. In that we have accommodated at the first available times the hearings and the voting sessions, et cetera. As I think the chairman is aware, we could have demanded the 5 days before a nominee could be considered, which means Mr. Tillerson could not be considered yet. So I just really want to first acknowledge that. Secondly, I assure you that the questions that I'm asking are not silly questions, but let me go beyond that. I don't think it's up to either the chairman or the ranking member to take away the prerogative of any member of this committee to ask the questions that they want to ask. That's been the history. You go back to the record of this committee, each member has the right to ask the questions they want to ask.
And we're going to accommodate the answering of those questions to the extent we can, and we always have, and had 3 rounds of questions here. With that, actually, is there any Republican that needs to speak? That's the order we'd be going in. Senator Menendez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick, I think Senator Cardin's remarks were that we were looking to do this prospectively so that there is no issue of looking at it as it relates to these nominees and that being unfair. I do think that when you have very large holdings that can affect your judgment if you are in the position in futuro, that it is of importance to this committee and to the Senate to know that and to use it as an additional judgment. So I'm totally in favor. As a matter of fact, the reason the rules actually preview and ask the question, are you willing to submit information, must be because that's a predicate to when there is a necessity to call upon for the information. So I hope we can do that prospectively, so this way it's not a question of, it's not seen as a partisan view. But let me go to Mr. Tillerson's, and I will be concise, but I do want to say a few things. First of all, after considering his nomination to be Secretary of State, I will be casting my vote against him today. For the 11 years that I have served on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I have taken the role of advice and consent of State Department nominees seriously. And while considering hundreds of nominations for both Democratic and Republican administrations, even where I disagreed with the nominees' views, especially when they were just espousing the views of an administration, I have often supported them if the other qualifications of the position I considered important were met. I respect Mr. Tillerson's experience and willingness to serve his country, but after our private meeting and lengthy public confirmation process, I remain deeply troubled by a number of Mr. Tillerson's responses and beliefs. I am not convinced that Mr. Tillerson shares a worldview that the United States foreign policy must be rooted in the values that strengthen us as a nation, championing democracy, upholding the rule of law, protecting human rights. And as I said during his hearing, business deal-making is not diplomacy. And I remain doubtful that Mr. Tillerson would fully embrace a wide-ranging policy to strengthen our alliances and forcefully confront our adversaries. It is not the type of moral clarity I would have liked to have heard him espouse. Additionally, I believe Mr. Tillerson was not entirely forthcoming in his response to my questions about both his personal and ExxonMobil's lobbying against sanctions, one of the most powerful tools in our arsenal of peaceful diplomatic levers, and many of which I have personally written. If I am charged with the responsibility to advise and consent, if I am to vote affirmatively for a nominee, I need honest and transparent answers. I simply do not feel I got them from Mr. Tillerson on these questions. Finally, as I said at a hearing, at a time when Russia's continuing aggression around the world and interference in our election must be at the top of America's diplomatic agenda and our chief concern to our Secretary of State, it is incredibly troublesome that Mr. Tillerson and President Trump had not even discussed the specifics of their Russia policy. I don't know how you choose to accept the position of Secretary of State when you don't have a global discussion, and if you did have a discussion, you don't even talk about Russia between what is happening in Ukraine, Aleppo, and in our own elections. So I believe Mr. Tillerson proved he lacks the sufficient knowledge or regard for the norms and necessities that so much of our modern diplomatic and security efforts depend upon. And I believe the American people deserve a chief diplomat to fully advocate for the interests and national security of all. I just did not get that from the process of this confirmation, and so therefore I will be voting no.
I think Markey wanted to be.
I think Senator Markey was the only other one.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just want to follow up on what Senator Cardin made reference to. In my repeated questioning of Mr. Tillerson with regard to his holdings on ExxonMobil, not personally, but the holdings of ExxonMobil inside of the country of Russia, he refused to commit to recusing himself from all matters related to ExxonMobil for the duration of the time that he would be Secretary of State. At the time at which Mr. Tillerson took over as CEO of ExxonMobil, they had very small holdings in Russia. Today, ExxonMobil holds an area that is the size of Wyoming for drilling purposes inside of Russia. That is, for my purpose, a fundamental conflict of interest. I would feel a lot more comfortable if Mr. Tillerson would agree to recuse himself from any matter related to ExxonMobil for the duration of his time as Secretary of State. He has refused to do so. During his time as CEO of ExxonMobil, the company opposed the sanctions on Russia that would hamper the business activity of ExxonMobil inside of that country. So I just think it's fundamental that Mr. Tillerson just recuse himself from any of those issues, because the American people have a right to know that it's their interests and not ExxonMobil's interests that are going to be advanced by these huge decisions which are going to be made over the next several years at the State Department and in the White House. And for that reason, I will cast a no vote on his nomination.
Thank you. And I'm more than glad to stay here and keep the meeting open for other comments as a courtesy to members who have other business. The motion before us, I'll ask a roll call vote for Rex Tillerson to be Secretary of State. The vote will be to report the nomination favorably. If the clerk will call the roll.
And Mr. Chairman, so I understand, I will be casting some proxy votes, but the members, when they come here, will be able to replace the proxy.
That's exactly right. And you know, we'll keep it open, let's say, instead of 5:15 to 5:30 to get time.
Well, if possible, I would ask, particularly in Senator Murphy's case, that if he's here later tonight, that he be able to replace his vote to be in person, if that would be possible.
We will attempt to figure out a way to accommodate that, short of me sitting here till 8 o'clock by myself. Okay. Okay. Thank you all very much for cooperating in this manner. If the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Rich.
Aye.
Mr. Rubio.
Yes.
Mr. Johnson.
Aye.
Mr. Flake.
Aye.
Mr. Gardner.
Aye.
Mr. Young.
Aye.
Mr. Barraza.
Aye.
Mr. Isaacson.
Aye.
Mr. Portman.
He'll be here shortly.
Paul.
He'll be back shortly.
Mr. Cardin.
No.
Mr. Menendez.
No.
Ms. Jeanine.
No.
Mr. Coons.
No.
Mr. Udall. No. Mr. Murphy.
No.
No by proxy.
Mr. Kane.
No by proxy.
Mr. Markey. No. Mr. Merkley. No. Mr. Booker.
No by proxy.
Mr. Chairman.
Aye. So now we're going to hold it
And I've
open.
just asked
Yeah.
consent that the roll call be held open.
And we'll, as members, if members do come in and want to vote in the middle, we'll stop the speaking to allow them to do so. Thank you. It's a little bit of a departure than the vote count than things have been in the past and on nominations like this, but I certainly respect everyone's ability to cast votes in the manner they wish. Does anyone wish now to speak? Senator Rubio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin by saying that I believe that all presidents, especially a new one, are entitled to a significant amount of deference on their cabinet appointments. I think this is a tradition that's evidenced by the fact that I believe in the 240-year history of the Republic, we've only had 9 cabinet nominees that have been voted down by the full Senate. But I also want to add that given how much uncertainty currently exists regarding the future direction of our nation's foreign policy, this nomination deserved a higher level of scrutiny than tradition otherwise would indicate, and that is in the spirit in which I entered into these deliberations. As you've already said, that Mr. Tillerson testified for over 8 hours. I spent about 4 or 5 weeks prior to this hearing researching and preparing for it. I've had the opportunity to have 2 extensive conversations with him. He's also responded to over 100 written questions, and for the record, none were about horses.
Thank you for that.
But, and a couple things I would say. The first is on the fundamental question of whether he's qualified to be Secretary of State. I believe that he is. He has a proven record of managing a large and complex organization, and he has extensive experience in international commerce. The one I struggled with was I strongly believe that our foreign policy is at its best and at its most effective when it's grounded in the moral principles and values at the core of our nation's birth, the defense of the God-given rights of all people to life and to liberty and to pursue happiness. And so for me, this wasn't simply a focus on Russia, which gets all the attention, although it was certainly a factor in it. My fundamental concern that I grappled with is that in the face of these calls that we have to move our foreign policy into the direction of what I believe is a sort of hyper-realism, my concern was that Mr. Tillerson would be an advocate for and would pursue a foreign policy of deal-making at the expense of traditional alliances and at the expense of the defense of human rights and of democracy. I want to say for the record that in my interactions with him and with the new administration, they exhibited a high level of professionalism and responsiveness, and I think that is important to point out. And that I was pleased on a number of fronts, both with his answers and some with his clarifications. There are other fronts, however, other questions where I remain troubled. And I found it necessary to balance the answers that I was troubled by with at least 4 separate factors. The first, of course, is his track record of leadership that I've outlined. The second was things like his support of NATO, his recognition that Russia's claims on Crimea are illegitimate, his commitment to the Asia-Pacific defense commitments that we have, his answers on Cuba, of particular concern to some of us, and his support of defensive armaments for Ukraine. I also balance it with the belief, as I've already stated, that the President deserves the chance to succeed and therefore should be given significant deference in choosing cabinet officials. And one additional point, which I think really came to light over the last 72 hours or a week for me, is the fact that given the extraordinary amount of uncertainty and anxiety that exists, both here at home and abroad, about the direction of our nation's foreign policy, I concluded that it would not be good for our country to unnecessarily delay or create unwarranted political controversy over this particular nomination. And I said this to you earlier, Mr. Chairman, and you were, I think, in agreement that as this committee moves forward with other appointments to critical posts in the Department of State, they will not be entitled nor receive from me the same level of deference that I've applied in this particular case. And so that's why on this nomination I have voted today to confirm Mr. Tillerson, and will do again in the full Senate. But as I informed him today in our conversation, I stand ready to help him succeed. I hope he does become the best Secretary of State our nation's ever had. But I also intend to hold him and more broadly the Department of State accountable on the issues that I have stated here today and that I remain concerned about. So I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I thank you, and I appreciated the call this morning and the thoughtfulness that went into making the decision. And I heard loud and clear that for other positions that where you feel there's maybe a lack of clarity on these issues, you might not be quite as forgiving, if you will.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Jeanine.
I have a statement that I would like to submit for the record, but I also have a few comments that I would like to make. I think one of the things, I appreciate the concern you're raising about the polarization on the committee about this nominee.
Yeah.
And for me, one of the things that made that so hard was the fact that Rex Tillerson, unlike previous secretaries of state in my memory, whether it's Hillary Clinton or John Kerry or Jim Baker, Madeleine Albright, Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, they all have a record in the public domain of positions they have taken and actions they have made on behalf of foreign policy issues that I could go to and say, this is how I think they might react in a given situation. We didn't have that with Mr. Tillerson. And for me, that was one of the difficult things in trying to evaluate the kind of leader that I thought he would be. And, you know, I have to say, after my meeting with him, I was inclined to view his nomination favorably. Mm-hmm. But I was very troubled by many of his responses in the hearing. Mm-hmm. I was reassured by what he had to say about NATO and international institutions, but very troubled, as Senator Rubio just commented, about his responses on human rights abuses and on his unwillingness to acknowledge that it's important for us to sanction Russia. And I know the view of this committee is that we need to take strong action against Russia when they violate international norms. And so I hope that he and the administration hear that loud and clear. I appreciated his support for women's economic empowerment and hope that as an engineer, he will look at the data when it comes to providing support for women's programs and particularly for things like family planning, which we know has a very significant impact in improving the lives of women and families and communities. I was concerned, as Senator Markey said, about his lack of forthrightness, as I saw it, on Exxon's dealings around lobbying and sanctions, and also his unwillingness to commit clearly on the importance of acting to address climate change. So there were some other issues that my written remarks address, but in the end, I just had too many concerns and questions about the kind of leadership he would provide at the State Department to feel comfortable with voting for him. Now, that said, I hope he's successful, because it's in all of our interests that our diplomatic efforts, our foreign policy is successful, and that this country is successful. So I hope to work closely with him and with the State Department, as we have since I've been on this committee, and I look forward to doing that and hope that he will prove me wrong in some of my concerns. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and I know y'all had a good meeting and had talked with you a little bit about that and him. I think, you know, Mr. Tillerson's an engineer, and I think he probably doesn't know the person he's getting ready to work for very well. And as a matter of fact, I would guess they probably spent under a couple of hours together, and sometimes people are a little reticent to get out over their skis, if you will, when they don't really know the person that they're getting ready to work for. But I know you had a very good private meeting, as did I, and I think most people on the committee. With that, do you want to record your vote?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to be recorded as a yes.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for coming back. Anyone else over here would like to make any comments? Over here, Senator Markley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to echo some of the thoughts my colleagues have expressed. That there were a series of positions that came up in the hearing that bothered me a great deal. Certainly, Enron's background in lobbying against the sanctions on Russia was one of them. But another,
Exxon.
I'm sorry, Exxon, not Enron. Thank you. Also very concerned about the subsidiary that Exxon set up to bypass our sanctions on Iran. We need a Secretary of State who is clear about the role of U.S. foreign policy. And when I asked him how he would respond if other companies did that when he was leading as Secretary of State, he didn't give a clear answer that he would work to have those companies abide and support the causes that American policymakers were pursuing with those sanctions. I'm also concerned about the statements and how he responded to the questions about the extrajudicial killings in the Philippines, his company's payments to the personal family of president or dictator for life in Equatorial Guinea, and his response to Russia's actions in Syria and the bombing of Aleppo and All of these things added up, I thought, to representing answers that you might expect from someone wearing their company hat, but not someone setting forth a moral compass for American leadership in the world. And that is the foundation on which I opposed him. Thank you.
Thank you. If I could, I'm not taking anyone to raise here, but I think the question about the sanctions was not about, I think what he tried to clarify is he didn't lobby against sanctions. He lobbied to try to make the equivalency between what we were doing here in the United States and what was happening in Europe to be more synchronized, because the European companies had advantages based on the way the sanctions were put in place, because they were grandfathered in as far as their activities, whereas that was not the case with the U.S. sanctions. So I think that was a clarification that I think he tried to make over and over in the committee. Anyone else wishing to? Senator Coons.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This was not a decision I made lightly. I have come to respect Mr. Tillerson's significant experience and broad role in business leadership over a lengthy public hearing and 2 very constructive private meetings, and I concluded he was a thoughtful and seasoned professional whose impressive business experience would actually serve him well in this role. I was encouraged by a number of his public stances, as some of my colleagues have said, his support for the NATO alliance, his respect for our leadership in multilateral initiatives, and in particular, in my case, his support for development programs, especially in Africa. But as I've remarked both publicly and to him, the transition from being CEO of Exxon to Secretary of State, given he has no previous public record, is a significant leap and one where I have heard overwhelming input from my constituents about their view of his potentially troubling ties to Vladimir Putin and to Russia, given how pressing that issue is for us in our foreign policy right now. His views do differ from mine in a few significant ways. I do view climate change as a pressing national security threat, and I do think that some of our core values in human rights, free press, and promotion of democracy need to be advanced at the same time that we work for our security and our economic interests, that our values and our interests are best when advanced together. And I came very close to voting for Mr. Tillerson because of the constructive role I believe he could play. But I frankly, in listening to the inaugural address of President Trump, concluded that American leadership on the world stage is not as simple as America First. And that I was even more concerned about a number of alarming things that the President said as a candidate on a whole range of issues, from human rights to NATO to climate change to Russia. And it is my deep hope that Mr. Tillerson, as Secretary, will challenge President Trump to rethink his isolationist and dark view of the world and to instead pursue a foreign policy that upholds our values and advances our interests. And if he is successful in that undertaking, I look forward to working closely with him and to recognizing the significant transition he's made and congratulating and thanking him on that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Again, I appreciated those comments. I know we had a nice conversation about this on Friday. I think to hold any nominee responsible for what the president-elect or the president now says is, I mean, to me, what we were looking for in a Secretary of State is the person who's going to be up under the hood giving advice to the president. And at the end of the day, every person is going to have to carry out Nikki Haley, carry out the president's policies. But what I thought we were looking for in a Secretary of State is someone who was going to be up under the hood advising the president in a way that we thought would be good for our country, not to measure them against comments at an inaugural address or comments during a campaign. And I do think it's unfortunate, and this is an observation, that what's happened here is this has really, in some ways, turned out to be a proxy on people's feeling about our president, not necessarily a proxy or a vote on the person who's actually coming in as Secretary of State. And to me, Mr. Tillerson is an adult who's been around, and while certainly doesn't know some of the political things that we know and haven't been sitting through hearings for 10 years, I do think he's a person that can be a very good anchor on the things that we care about. And that was what I measured him by, not by comments made during a campaign, not by comments made at an inaugural address. I don't think any of us could possibly hold nominees responsible for what someone else says if we happen to disagree with that. So I looked at it in a different way, as I've said during the opening comments, but it's very evident to me that in some cases here on the committee, it's really turned out to be a proxy on the election itself, and it's disappointing, but
Mr. Chairman,
that's what's happened.
If I could respond just very briefly on that. I don't think that's the case at all. I think what has been said is that, Mr. Trump's our president. We want him to succeed. He can't possibly manage every part of government, and his cabinet appointments are critically important to this country. They have a great deal of discretion in the way they operate their agencies. The advice and consent role of the Congress, of the Senate, is critically important to make sure that these individuals are qualified for the positions they're taking, but also give us an opportunity, and the American people, quite frankly, to understand the passion and commitment of these individuals to the roles that they are taking. We have seen over and over again on the nominees that Mr. Trump has made that they have taken positions that are different than candidate Trump took. We've seen that with General Mattis, now the Secretary of Defense, when he talked about the NATO alliance. He came out very strongly in support of the NATO alliance, quite differently than President Trump did as candidate Trump. And I think General Mattis was being just straightforward as to his beliefs, and that's one of the reasons why he received almost unanimous support by the United States Senate to be confirmed as Secretary of Defense. We saw in Mr. Tillerson's case, and I really want to underscore this, I think he's a good person. I think he's well qualified from the point of view of his business experience and his negotiating skills. But what I think troubled many of us is that when you look at the fundamental responsibility for Secretary of State to promote American values, and you contrast that to some of the other nominees and the comments that they were prepared to make about their passion. I already mentioned the point in regards to war crimes, which is something that's pretty sensitive to many of us here, particularly when we've seen what's happened in Aleppo, thanks to Russian support. Or we see what's happening in the Philippines with extrajudicial killings. Or we saw the response to the question on a national registry. When we asked him how he felt about Muslim Americans being registered, and he gave a more generic response. He didn't just say that it would be wrong to have any type of registry in this country for any group of ethnic or religion Americans. It's important to the values of our country. He didn't express that. Or when the question was asked, I forgot who asked about the LGBT community. And he couldn't respond on that specific. He said, I'm against any form of discrimination. Okay. But you need to have a view that when you're going to be Secretary of State, the world is looking upon you for leadership on these issues. So it's not so much that we don't want to get ahead of get in front of the heads of our skis. That was not the issue. Because we understand that Mr. Trump will be and is the leader on all these issues. We understand that. But we wanted to know what the Secretary of State, our future Secretary of State, felt passionate on these issues. And I'm going to agree with Senator Jeanine. It is very likely that Mr. Tillerson will be confirmed to be Secretary of State. With the vote in this committee, I think most of us can do our counting, and we expect that he will be confirmed. And I can assure you, Mr. Chairman, this committee will play an important role, and every member of this committee will play an important role. And we want him to succeed as Secretary of State. We want him to promote the values. I was listening very carefully to Senator Rubio's comments, and I share so much of his passion on the human rights issues. So it's going to be important that we all work together to make this country continue to be the leader globally on these issues. And we will do everything we can to make sure that we have a successful administration and a successful Secretary of State on these issues, and we will work with them. But I think it's our responsibility to point out not only to our constituents but to the American people that there was disappointment in the manner in which Mr. Tillerson responded to these questions, although they may have been consistent with President Trump. That was not our issue. It was not our issue as to whether we are trying to be a proxy for President Trump. It's not at all that. It's not at all. I intend to vote for several of President Trump's